Hello and welcome to The Brief. Today's The Brief, we'll be talking about a topic that is quite controversial, and it does raise a lot of emotion depending on what side of the motion you are for. Today we'll be looking at repatriation of art. Is it time to bring back our art, as some people will say? Because back in the colonial days, a lot of colonial governments took away artifacts and figures and a lot of historical things from Africa, and they're stashed in museums all over Europe. And African countries are saying, look, it's time we bring back these things because they mean a lot to our cultural heritage. And to talk about this, we have in the studio two fantastic guests. We have Aderonke Adeola. She's a documentary filmmaker and an art enthusiast. Thanks for joining us on the debrief, Adeola. And Aderonke. And we also have Ekundayo Kennii. She's an art curator. Thanks for joining us on the debrief. So the first question is, how did these things get to Europe, these artifacts? Were they stolen? We're trying to look for the language. Were they stolen? Were they taken? Were they looted? People have used different words. I'll let you go first.
Well, absolutely, they were stolen. The film that I'm promoting at the moment, Awani, deals a lot with colonialism and the intersection between colonialism and gender inequality. And we didn't ask to be colonized. It was forced upon us. And as a result, they took slaves, they took our resources, and they destroyed a lot of what they found on ground. So absolutely, it wasn't some trade exchange. It was absolutely stolen from us.
And it was a one-sided
It was 100%, and benefiting only one side.
Kennii, what's your take on that? Do you think they were taken or stolen or looted?
Or borrowed.
Or borrowed, yeah.
Well, first of all, I would like to state that this is a very sensitive topic that needs diplomatic language, because you don't want to accuse these people of having stolen this.
But aren't you whitewashing history? For example, you look at the Benin punitive expedition, the whole city was razed, and then these bronzes were clearly stolen. So there's no...
Punitive expedition?
Yeah, for fighting against colonial rule that you didn't ask for in the first place.
Oh, well, I think...
What language would you use? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Okay, because there was an era which is now legalized, which is now seen as an important part of our history, you would want to say they were collected.
Okay.
Wow.
They were collected by brute force, if I may add that. Now, there's this. Let's get to the crux of the matter. There's this talk about, you know, is it right? Who owns it? Is it finders keepers? Something that's been in your collection for over 100 years, some 200 or more than that. Does it belong to you, or does it belong to the origin? What's your take on that?
Of course it is ours. Our ancestors made these things. They're ours. They kept them. They didn't make them, and they took them. They didn't pay for their value. They didn't pay the price. So of course it absolutely belongs to us.
And Kennii?
It belongs to us. These works belongs. They belong to us. They are part of a very important historical narrative, if you want to say. Yeah. And it's undisputed, even if they collected it. I'm trying to be diplomatic, as I mentioned earlier, but it's ours. You can't dispute that. Talking
about collection, they collected it. They are stashed in museums in France, in Belgium, in Germany, all over Europe, and they make billions of dollars in revenue, tourist revenue for them. Is it not time we collect it back? And also make some money, and of course the historical importance and cultural heritage that comes with it?
It's been time. The time's been up for a long while now. I sincerely believe that from the moment a country, one of the colonized countries, gained independence, it was due for us to get back these works. So in the case of Nigeria, for example, we are over 60 years, almost 60 years due for our works to be returned back to us. So
Ronke, do you share the same sentiment?
Absolutely, and I would go even further and say they should measure how much revenue they made from these collections and the visitors. I mean, I've been to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, I've been to the British Museum, and they're all in different rooms. So I think they can actually quantify how much they made. So not only should they return them, they should return them with a check.
You know, it would have been nice to have someone on the panel, maybe someone, a representative of the government of France or Germany. But let's look at some of the arguments by former colonizers. They said they came into their collections legally because of the times they lived in. They also argue that some of these countries did not even exist as countries in that time. Like, they had not had the Berlin Conference, and they said we cannot maintain them. So let's talk about this first 3 points. What do you make of it? Especially the maintenance part. You're an art curator. They say, oh, Africans can't maintain it. They would last longer, and they're doing it for humanity and the civilization of man. That's why they're in the Louvre and other museums.
If we are able to create these works, it shouldn't even come up as an argument about how we can't maintain them. Because we have works some of the works that survived the looting era, which you could call the colonial period too. They are still existent. We still have them. So how are we not able to maintain these works?
So it's not a valid argument.
It's not a valid argument on one hand, but on the other hand, currently we are in a political era, you could say, that doesn't give a lot of focus to the maintenance of our works, to the maintenance of anything. And a focal point is the National Museum we have here in Uniko. I remember my last visit there. And I
was there about 2 months ago.
I walked around and I was shouting, this place is a disgrace.
Yeah, there's actually
that's one of
exactly. So one of the reasons why they should bring them back, so it could.
Oh well, no, that's one of the reasons why these people could bring up an argument like, oh, we don't have a maintenance culture here.
Ronke, I see you're eager to jump in, so go ahead.
I feel we shouldn't mix issues. My property, my heritage is mine to destroy or preserve. Let's not mix issues. If we want to preserve them, let's preserve them. If we don't, let us not. But it is ours. You must return what you have taken illegally. And when you say legally, illegally, once upon a time in history, it was legal to put Jewish people in gas chambers. So justice is blind, and it often serves the oppressor. So let's put the law to one side, and they should be returned with a check. Because our arts, let's not pretend that we have a thriving arts culture that is comparative to the West, right? Where our art industry in the past 10 years, there have been many gains, there are many platforms, things are developing, and there's an upward trajectory, in my opinion. And it's not patriotism. There's a lot of evidence for this. So things are happening with our institutions. However, you must return them, and whether we preserve them in the best, we build institutions, of course, return them with a check so we can keep them in the great
and if you're so concerned about humanity, why don't you build those conditions, those type of, as a form of repatriation, and the context of it, it's here.
And it's still that colonial mentality that you guys can't preserve it, telling us what to do with my property.
Sounds very colonial.
It's extremely colonial.
But then again, I mean, a lot of people don't want to get emotional about things like this. They say, all we just want is bring it back. But in the 1970s and 80s, the then Zaire, the present-day Democratic Republic of Congo, under Mobutu Sese Seko, started a conversation with Belgium, and they did repatriate some of this artifacts, only for them to show up in auction houses in Europe a few years later. And they point to examples of what happened in the Congo and say, corruption, lack of maintenance culture, and all of that.
Again, that happened. That doesn't necessarily mean it will happen here. And you entrusted it into a corrupt government. I don't think that just because you return, that's one example. It's not good enough. It's not good enough.
Absolutely. Now we have a tweet for those that a tweet buttressing why they shouldn't return the artifacts to Africa and saying that it belongs to all of humanity. Okay, Yamuyu Mau Mau says, have you been to any European museum? Then you would know why they're refusing to give back African relics, which they stole and tried to falsify as European history. If they ever returned African art and all relics, Europe will be sitting empty on the cement. Interesting. And there's a joke about the British Museum that how many British things you actually have in the British Museum, because the Greeks want to get back the
Elgin marbles,
Elgin marbles and all of that. Okay, and still on, they also say that, you know, Africans don't appreciate arts and all of that. What do you make of that?
Generalizations are dangerous. Generalizations, especially Africans are this, Africans are that. They're often rooted in racism, colonialist sentiment, and bring back the items and let's show you the possibilities of what we can do with them. And essentially, let's not mix issues. Issue number one: you took something that did not belong to you. You profited from something that did not belong to you. Return them. Whatever happens to them, happens.
That's as simple as that.
Those are separate issues.
Yeah. Kennii, as an art curator, how important is it for the younger generation to learn about this art, and what can he do in the education process? And I mean, the self-esteem of a young African, seeing all this complex artifacts that were taken hundreds of years ago.
The current time we live in demands that when you teach history to the younger generation, as we'd like to call it, it's important that you give them physical evidence. If you want to tell me about the Nok culture, we have works that depict this culture, but they are not here. They are in these museums, and we need them here to lend to that teaching, to lend to whatever we tell them, to lend to that history relearning that we are trying to initiate to these people. So yes, we need our works back, and no matter how they try to, they being this the Western, the Western museums and the Western collectors, no matter how they try to make it seem that we can't take care of these works, that we are not deserving of these works, it's not true. African art has become it's become a hot cake, you could say, especially now. So you can't say that we won't be able to care for these works the way you have, or we are not motivated enough, we don't have...
Or sophisticated enough.
Or we don't have enough knowledge. If you are trying, if we live in a period where our works are being valued, the world is raving about African art, then what are you trying to say? How are we not creative enough? How are we not intelligent enough?
It negates the argument totally.
It does.
We have a video from a fellow art curator like you. Her name is Nomaza, and she explains, she shares her thoughts on Africans and their level of cultural intelligence and appreciation.
You know that when they took them for the first time, those artworks were not even seen as artworks, they were not even entered into the museum. The same objects were seen as objects of curiosity. So there were things that were done because they thought that Africans were into spiritual, they were creating these objects because, you know, there were bizarre people in the 19th century. That changed. We took the same objects and we put them into human museums in the same sphere as science. 20th century, the same objects were put into galleries and museums. So what I'm trying to say about this is that how our culture has been seen as something that is of value. Unfortunately, we have not played a role in that. We've just been, somebody else has been leading and we've just been dancing. I will make a simple example. I am artists because I promote young emerging artists that are not even known in the countries that I'm promoting them from, it in South Africa, Mozambique, or Zimbabwe, or in Nigeria. I take them immediately to Europe. And when they arrive there, people from South Africa, they will call and say, but how much does it cost? Can I have it? But then the artist has already gone out. Had they known about cultural literacy, they would have been.
And that's Nomaza there. We apologize for the quality of the audio. Just basically shared her thoughts on the subject matter. You are a filmmaker and you're currently working on a project. Wani, can you tell us a bit about that?
So Wani, I mean, it's perfect for this conversation.
Okay, just hold your thoughts for a second. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation on the debrief. Do stay with us. Welcome back to the debrief, and today we're looking at the art. Is Africa ready for Bring Back Our Art? We're talking about stolen and looted art that was taken away from the motherland hundreds of years ago, and there's ongoing debate and conversation about should Africans ask and demand for the repatriation of this art, or do they belong in European museums, where some have argued that they will be better preserved for the sake of all of humanity. It's not just an African thing. Now, President Emmanuel Macron is at the forefront of returning. He was speaking at a university in Ouagadougou last year, and he said, you know, this artifacts are very important to the people of Africa and the society and the children, that they are better off in Africa. How do we get more European leaders to have this sort of conversation, and what's the best approach to take in returning our artifacts? I'll start with you, Ronke.
I think perhaps one of the ways that we can do that is countries that have had their art taken from them via colonialism perhaps form some sort of collective through the African Union. So I think it's far stronger to speak as a collective of African countries and say, this is a problem, and there will be some, you know, taking to the international, you know, human rights. It's a human rights issue, if you ask me.
Kennii, some argue that, you know, Africans are still dealing with poverty and issues of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like clothing, food, shelter, and that, you know, arts are it's for people with refined taste. That why are we wasting our time about this conversation? What do you have to say?
It's a very insulting phrase for all its worth and for all it seems, because you can't try to push that narrative that I think it actually belongs to the dark ages, and it should be kept there. You can't bring it back to this current period where African art is really thriving, and then you try to push in topics of our inability to fend for ourselves as a reason why we don't deserve our art back. It's a really insulting phrase.
I think we have a tweet up. Okay. Let's see what this tweet says. Kaisel says, did you guys know that before any of the European art we can call legendary was African art, and the Europeans stole our visions and whitewashed it while simultaneously demonizing our artwork and call it dark art? It's interesting that you steal from people you referred to as inferior in the past. Now, let's move away from that for a second and talk about your work. Ronke, you have a project, Awani. Can you shed some more light on it?
So it's a short documentary looking at how colonialism impacted gender roles in Nigeria. Colonialism is this huge hotbed. The reason why I created the documentary is that I was looking at the antecedents of gender roles in Nigeria and colonization
Nigeria.
and pre-colonial Nigeria, and it's really sad because a lot of our documented history, there's very little prior to the British arriving in Nigeria, and I find that very interesting that there's not a lot of information on who we were before the British came. I mean, there's a lot of oral tradition. But in terms of documented manuscripts and things like that, there's not much there. But that's why it totally links to what we're talking about.
But it's peculiar to Nigeria, and
not just because
some people say. I mean, you see the ancient manuscripts in Timbuktu, and they claim Africans never had a writing system. You see they have.
But we had. So what is writing? It's a form of communication. But we did have forms of communication. If you always look at our civilization through a Western lens, you will find a lot of inferiorities. But we were independent. We had our own forms of. Not to say that it was perfect, but nowhere is perfect.
Yeah, we traded. We had societies. We had checks and balances. We had kingdoms.
We had this. We'd fight. There were wars with tribes. So it wasn't this perfect utopia, but it was ours.
And our civilization was disrupted, as a lot of people will say. Now let's talk about your business, Kennii.
I am currently working on a project that interrogates the artist's perception of beautiful. What is beauty? What is beautiful to the artist, and how is he or she able to translate that onto their canvas? How are they able to portray beauty in the light of what the artistic minds bring up? So I would be having an exhibition to that effect this October, and it's a tripartite project. It's I have 2 exhibiting artists who are the frontliners, if you want to say, and I have a documentary that is also coming up too, and would feature artists based in Lagos discussing and giving their own opinions on what beautiful means to them, how they are able to interpret it in their works, and a few works from private collections.
Oh, quite interesting. I'm sure New Central will be there to cover the event. Okay, let's take some more tweets. We'll get your reaction. Remember to tweet at us at New Central TV. Okay, we have a tweet up from Leah. She says, it's not anybody's business whether or not Congo can look after their artwork. It's theirs. Britain stole it, so they should give it back. Okay, actually, if you're talking about Congo, it's Belgium that stole it, but I get the point there. And Nimbus at Gallery says, the fact that the British government can comfortably display other people's nation's heritage in its museum. Okay. I've noticed that Salon says a podcast of Western people discussing if they should return the looted African art. The privilege in this podcast, guys, and Gathy, they are doing Africans a favor. I guess that's what that person means. And this one from Tabi Sapato says, one of the best things about the information age is seeing other African art being celebrated all over the world, not because some person stole it and displayed it in a museum, but because Africans own and are sharing their art. So it's so lovely. Interesting tweets there. Now, just before we wrap up, we cannot have this conversation without talking about history. It's said that a person without a history is like a tree without its roots. How important is history to you?
It's essential, especially for Black people, and I use the term Black specifically. If you see what's happening in America and the discussions of reparations, history lets us know not just what our ancestors did, but what we're entitled to, what our rights are. And that discussion of reparations, and they were taken from their homeland, and our resources, our people, our gold, our whatever, all our resources were taken, and it's essential that we interrogate appreciate this and know what we're entitled to. And one thing I want to add very quickly, you know, Toni Morrison died recently, may she rest in peace. And it's a function, and I'm poorly quoting, I don't know the exact quote, but it is a function of racism and oppression when the oppressor has you defending your right to what is yours.
Absolutely. And that's basically what we're arguing about here. Kennii, how important is history to you?
History is important to us. It's undisputed. And in relations to this particular conversation about bringing back our art, it's still history. We are asking for our history to be given back to us. This was a documentation of the pre-colonial era, and that is why it's very important. It's primarily the reason for this specific request. This is part of our heritage, you could say, our cultural heritage. And for the fact that the Western Museum and Collective are still hanging on to these works is a pointer to how important history is, because it tells a story of us in their time. But
Absolutely.
If you take out these works from, if these works are returned back to Africa, what is left for them to talk about?
Absolutely, and I love that point that you made. It's also important to know that Africa's history did not start with slave trade and colonialism.
Never.
We really need to do that, and I'm sure we'll probably have a debrief about history on its own, because it's a huge topic. And I believe that if a lot of young Africans really knew their history, not from a Eurocentric point of view, the facts of their history, that there were great kingdoms, we had mathematical systems, we had seafarers, we had mathematicians, we had universities in Alexandria, and great empires. The average African will walk with his head up high, and he will be very proud. It does a lot of positive things to your self-esteem if you know your worth and your history. Now, finally, I know I asked this before. Give your reasons and why should the artifacts be returned, and is Africa ready for our arts to come back?
They belong to us, so it's like she said, it's a minus countdown. They absolutely belong to us, and we have every right to what our ancestors created for themselves and for their descendants. So bring them back with a check.
Okay, and Kennii?
Playing to the tune of colonization. After colonization, we became independent, and that means we became free from their administration, from Western administration. So it's high time it's returned. It's been long overdue, I would say again, because that's why do you call us independent if we can't be entirely free from your tentacles, Mr. Colonizer?
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you young women about arts and returning of our artifacts. I do really appreciate your insights on the subject matter. And that's all we can take on this week's Debrief. Remember, you can follow the conversation online at News Central TV and keep the conversation going. Thank you very much. It's been nice doing this with you. I'm Gbenga Aborowa. Have a nice weekend.